Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail. Today we are going to share scary Wendigo horror stories. First story, Wendigo, the Encounter. So I don't really know how to start this, so I'm just going to spew out some stuff and hope it all makes sense because it sure as hell doesn't to me. Have any of you even encountered one before? If not, let me tell these things are not like how Google or any of pictures you find depicts them, at least not right away. I'd get into it. I'm from Canada, and I live on a reserve that's about 30 minutes from any town relatively close compared to other places I've been. Well, it's the end of December, and just getting finished with holidays and spending it relatively alone. Thanks, COVID. I get a call from one of my friends. He wants to go hunting. Well, that's kind of a problem because I've never shot a gun or went hunting before. Pretty pathetic for a Native American, if you ask me. But anyways, he tells me he just needs my eyes and another set of legs to help carry whatever he catches. So I agree, making one of the biggest mistakes I would come to regret. So he picks me up in his crappy old Ford truck he uses for hunting, tells me we are going deep into the bush, and we'll find a spot to camp along the way. So we drive about 20 minutes into the woods following what little road is left, and we get to a point where we have to continue on foot. We unload our gear and supplies and carry it till we find a nice clearing with room for everything after we set up camp, we begin our trek into the woods, going farther than I had gone before. Saw a couple of bucks and rabbits, nothing too spectacular. So we keep looking cause he wants the big daddy buck, and we come to this other clearing much larger than the one we are camping at, and something about this part of the woods just feels off. It had a heavy feeling to like the air was thick and just a disorienting aura about this place. But we hadn't caught anything yet and we're getting hungry, so we spot a rabbit in the middle of this clearing. Buddy lines up the shot, and bam, we have dinner. So being the one without the gun, I go to get our little dinner in the middle of this clearing, and I notice something odd, that it's a perfect circle. No tree stumps, no sign that any human had made this gigantic circle. I also happened to notice what looked like claw marks on the trees surrounding the area. Buddy said it's from bears sharpening claws and marking territory, but the marks were so deep into the trees it seemed off. Anyways, it's dark out now, and we are back at our campsite eating and talking about how crazy this pandemic shit is. I also brought up the clearing we were at and how weird it felt to me. I wanted to know if he felt like that too, or if I was just exaggerating. My anxiety makes me do that sometimes. To which he said, yeah, he noticed a change in the air too, and said it made him feel dizzy and worn out, but he also said it just could have been from the long day we had. So on that note, it was time for bed. We both slept in same tent. It's the middle of winter, and bundling up can only do so much, plus he was like a brother to me. It had to be around 1 a.m., when we both woke up to sound of the most horrible scream I'd ever heard. What that was my first, though. I'm guessing my friend was thinking the thing as he looked at me with fear on his face. I know, because I was afraid too. So he grabs his gun, loads a round into the thing, and we just sit there for a while and listen. Now I know my friend is at least safe, he's got a gun, but I have nothing. Fear and my anxiety start getting the better of me. So I ask, where's the hatchet we used to split wood? Out there by the fire. He said, so I tell him I'm going to open the tent, grab the hatch, and when I jump in, you seal the thing back up. I open the tent, and as fast as I can bolt to grab that hatchet. As I go to turn around with hatchet in hand, I'm quickly greeted by my friend shoving me down by the back of my neck. He put his finger up to his mouth to tell me to be quiet, and we listen. In the distance, I can hear the slow sound of crunching snow and a faint, high-pitched guttural growl. Now I'm in full panic mode. We don't even have to say anything to each, cause we both know our hunting trip was over and it was time to leave. All we had to do was make it to the truck in the dead of night. It sounded so easy. But it wasn't, and I knew it from the moment I heard, I'm going to fire a warning shot. Before I could even open my mouth to tell him, no, it was too late. The shot rang in the distance, and for a moment there was silence. Then we heard it, a scream, so soul-piercing it felt like it lasted forever. It definitely echoed and lingered much more than this gunshot did. It was petrifying. I'd never heard such a haunting scream before that I was literally frozen in fear. Then we could hear whatever made this scream was charging right for us, with the sound of crunching snow getting closer and closer. We looked at each other and just ran in the direction of the truck, frantically sprinting, calling out to each other to make sure the other hadn't fallen behind. We're almost there, we kept telling each other as we are weaving through trees, making a beeline to the truck, trying to ignore the sound of this growl that sounds like it's right in my ear, but I can see the truck, we're going to make it, we're getting out of here. As we come up to the truck, my friend makes it to his side and unlocks both passenger and driver's side at the same time. As I open the door, he does so at the same time, and then he's gone in a flash of white. This thing had gotten him, ran at him with such force that when it tackled him, it shook the truck side to side. I stood there in shock. I call out to him, but all I can hear are screams and a couple gunshots, and then dead silence again. I know in my heart that my friend is dead. And so if I don't get out of here, I go over to the driver's side and find the keys on the ground. He must have let them go when he got tackled. I hop and start the damn thing, whip it around in the direction I needed to get out of here. Then I saw it. Skin as white as snow, completely hairless. Eyes that had sunken into its head, made dark circles around eyes that were just as white as its skin. No nose. Teeth so jagged and sharp-shined with the color of blood, and its lips looked like they had been chewed off, so all you're staring at is teeth. Its body was so disproportioned, long, lanky limbs. This thing is blocking me from leaving, but I'm getting out of here no matter what. I floor with the tires spinning, I shoot forward, and so does it, screaming that blood-curdling scream as it charges at me. Now I'm getting up close and personal as this thing lunges at the truck and bounces of the hood and over top of the truck. As I am speeding away, I glance at the rear view mirror and witness this thing get up and just stand there watching me drive off with its head tilted slightly. I knew I had just escaped death with the price of losing my friend. Second story. My grandma used to tell me scary stories when I was little. There's one I'll never forget. I was 10 years old when Grandma came to live with us. It was about 6 months after Granddad passed away, and I guess, looking back, she must have been lonely in that big house of theirs, rattling around with only the grief and memories for company. So despite a few protests from Mom, my parents took her in. There were no protests from me. None at all. Grandma was loud and fun, and I loved her. She had an almost limitless supply of boiled sweets, and she'd always slip me a couple whenever she saw me. She was always the first to stick up for me when I got in trouble too. But it was her stories I loved best. Grandma had all kinds of stories. Stories about growing up during World War II, and stories about the things she'd get up to with her friends on the South Coast after her family had been evacuated. Sad stories, funny stories, adventure stories. But it was her scary stories that were my favorite. Grandma had lots of scary stories. She told me she dabbled in the occult when she was a teenager, trying out Ouija boards with her friends, tarot cards, fortune-telling, all that stuff. Most of the stories I'd laugh off or forget about not long after she was done telling them. But there were a couple that really did spook me a bit. I was only 10 at the time, you have to understand, and Grandma certainly knew how to bring the stories to life. She'd shut off the lights in my room, so only the glow of the night sky shone through the curtains, and she'd shuffle in real close. Close enough so I could see the wrinkles on her face and smell the boiled sweets on her breath. Close enough so her deep blue eyes could stare straight into mine. She must have given me nightmares with a few of those tales, but now, years later, there's only one that I can still remember. Only one that stuck with me. The story about the shower and Mr. Longfingers. Grandma told me about Mr. Longfingers one night after I asked about her baths. Grandma used to love her baths. She'd spend ages in them, light candles and incense, and lie in the tub humming to herself until the water turned cold. It drove my mom crazy, but when I asked her why she loved them so much, she said it was the only place she could relax. It was the only place that was safe for her to relax. You know, people like me who are, well, more sensitive to certain things, we have to have baths, she told me seriously one night, shuffling closer on the bed. I couldn't possibly spend that long in the shower. It'd be far too risky. Grandma stared at me with those blue eyes of hers, unsmiling, and I knew it was time for one of her stories. One of the scary ones. I shivered with pleasure and pulled the covers up to my chin. "Why is it risky, Grandma?" She half turned to look out the window, watching me from the corner of her eye, pausing for effect. I waited, feeling my heart rate pick up ever so slightly in my chest. "Well," she said after a moment, "it's only risky if you close your eyes, of course. If you close your eyes for longer than 10 seconds. "What do you mean? Why?" "Well, do you ever play that game in the playground with your friends? The one where someone turns their back, and the others sneak up on them when they're not looking?" I nodded, and Grandma nodded back. "Exactly. So that's what it's like in the shower, when you have your eyes closed. That's what it's like with Mr. Longfingers." A cold itch tickled back. "Who's Mr. Longfingers, Grandma?" She let out a deep breath, as if she wished she hadn't said anything, turned her head back to face mine. When she next spoke, she lowered her voice. "No one knows exactly," Grandma whispered. "Some think it's a creature that's attracted to the heat and smell we give off in there. Others think it's a demon that finds a way into our realm through the dense steam clouds. No one can say for sure, because the only ones who have actually seen Mr. Longfingers aren't ever going to be able to tell you." I pulled in a breath. "Why not?" Grandma shuffled closer along the bed and leaned towards me, leaving my question hanging in the air. "Don't you worry about it, sweetheart. Don't worry your pretty head. As long as you remember the rules, you'll be fine." "What rules?" "Well, when you're in the shower, you try not to close your eyes for too long. 5 seconds is fine, and 10 is just about okay, too. But any longer than that..." "Yeah? Then what?" "Well, any longer than that, and you may just start to feel something in the room with you. Something watching. And if you ever go longer than 15 seconds, that's when you might start to hear a noise, too." "Hear what?" "The soft tap, tap, tap of fingers on glass. Fingers drumming against the glass door of the shower. If you do ever hear that noise, God forbid, will you make me a promise?" "What, Grandma?" "Promise me you'll never open your eyes. Asterisk, I barely slept that night. Hardly at all. I'd close my eyes and try to relax, but every time I did, I'd imagine a face pressed against my bedroom window, staring in at me. And when I'd finally get to sleep, I had nightmares. Bad ones. I had them all week, in fact. Dreams about disembodied eyes watching me in the dark, and long fingers reaching out to touch my exposed skin. It wasn't any better when I was awake, either. Not really. The shower was the worst. That's when Grandma's story really got to me. I never thought about it before, but suddenly I had trouble shutting my eyes in there. I'd be standing beneath the beating water, shampoo running down my face. And as soon as I squinted my eyelids closed, I'd hear Grandma's words running through my head. 5 seconds is fine, and 10 is just about okay, too. But any longer than that, I'd rub my hair fast, feeling the shampoo dripping off my chin. And as soon as I counted past 5 seconds, I'd feel it. A sort of pressure, not a feeling of being watched, exactly, but something close to that. I'd run my fingers faster and faster through my hair, frantically trying to get the suds out, and the ready blackness behind my closed eyes coupled with a rush of water in my ears would feel like a held breath. Like the silence before a scream. The seconds would race through my mind, and I'd be so desperate to open my eyes again that I'd sometimes do it before my hair was rinsed fully clean, and my eyes would sting with shampoo. But before I shut them again, I'd always be sure to peer out through the steamed glass door of the shower cubicle, just to make sure I was still alone. Asterisk. It wasn't long before Mum realized something was up. She heard me crying out in my sleep one night, and came in to comfort me, asked me what the matter was, and it all came out. I told her about Grandma's stories and about Mr. Longfingers. She got this look on her face when I was telling her like she used to get with me when I'd made her really mad. This wide-eyed, angry look. Only this time, she wasn't angry with me. She was angry with Grandma. My parents' room was next to mine, and sometimes if I pressed my ear against the wall, I could hear them talking in there. Soft whispers. That night, though, after Mom was satisfied, I wasn't scared anymore, and she'd gone back to her room. The whispers weren't soft at all. Oh no. I heard Mom hissing to Dad about Grandma, about the stories she'd told me. Mom's voice floated through the wall, sharp and crisp. You know what your fucking mother said to him now? Don't you, Simon? Dad's response was an unintelligible mutter. She's told him there's a monster that'll get him if he shuts his eyes in the shower. A monster. The poor kid's been having nightmares about it all week. Seriously, Simon, you'd better say something to her tomorrow morning, first thing. Or I will. Grandma came to visit me in my room the following night. That time, as she perched on the end of my bed, there were no stories. Nothing like that. Grandma just sat there and stared down at me, her blue eyes wide and sad. The light from the moon outside my window lit up her wrinkled face. You know I'd never let anything bad happen to you, don't you? She said after a moment. I nodded my head. I know, Grandma. You know I wouldn't let you come to any harm? I nodded again. Okay, good. That's good. She looked away from me for a moment. Out the window. You know, the things I tell you in the evening are meant to help you, sweetheart. They're meant to toughen you up a bit. Protect you. She paused and shook her head. But maybe your mom's right. Maybe I went too far this time. She looked down at me and smiled. But even then, even though I was only 10 years old, I could tell it didn't quite reach her eyes. I'll tell you what, Grandma said. You know what I told you about Mr. Longfingers in the shower? Well, I'm going to make sure you're safe. I'll scare the bastard off. How about that? It won't come back in a hurry if it has to face me. I stared up at Grandma, watching her face glow in the moonlight, watching her smile down at me. I nodded my head once. Asterisk. I was the one who found her. I don't know when exactly it happened, but I guess it was about a week after we had that talk in my room. A week after she told me she wouldn't let me come to any harm. I woke early that morning from a bad dream to a heavy thumping sound. I sat bolt upright in bed. My room was quiet around me, and I couldn't hear anything from the wall that joined my parents' room either. But the house wasn't entirely silent. Floating down the hall, muffled by my closed door, I could hear the sound of rushing water, the noise of the shower. I leapt out of bed and ran down the upstairs hallway, heart already pounding in my chest. As soon as I reached the closed bathroom door, I started banging on it. A deep terror was welling up inside me like cold water from a well, something I couldn't place, and I kept banging and shouting Grandma over and over again, even though she didn't respond. Off to my right, I was dimly aware of voices from my parents' room, the sleepy shuffle of footsteps, but before they had a chance to make it out onto the landing, I'd lifted my hand to test out the door handle, more out of instinct than because I thought it might actually open. But the door wasn't locked. I kept banging with my free hand, and it swung suddenly inwards, bringing me face to face with a wall of steam. Heat struck my skin. I squinted my eyes against the damp fog and peered into the bathroom. And before Dad pushed me to one side, before everything around me descended into shouting and tears and chaos, I saw her. I saw Grandma. She was lying naked on the floor in the shower cubicle, the water beating down around her, blue eyes bulging from her face. One hand was curled against her chest, like a dead bird, while the other trailed against the glass of the shower cubicle. The flailing finger marks she'd carved through the steam, still clear and fresh. Asterisk. It was a heart attack that killed her. That's what my dad told me. He said Grandma was old, and the thing had struck her quickly and suddenly. She would have died fast and without pain, Dad said. She wouldn't have suffered. I knew better, though. Even as a 10-year-old kid, I knew better. And years later, writing this as an adult, I still know better. I also know my wife and kids resent me for refusing to have a shower in the house, for insisting everyone take baths. They pretend it's okay, and they humor me, but I can tell they don't really understand it. Not at all. My wife thinks she does. She thinks I still carry the trauma of seeing my grandmother dying in front of me when I was little. I guess she's right in a way, but she doesn't know the full truth. Nobody does. And no one would believe me even if I told them. No one would believe me if I said the reason I don't take showers, the reason I haven't had one since I was 10 years old, isn't because I'm scarred from the sight of a dead body. It's because all those years ago, when I crept back into the still hot bathroom after the paramedics had taken Grandma's body downstairs, I made sure to check the marks her fingers had carved through the steamed glass of the shower cubicle. And those marks weren't just on the inside. Third story. My neighbor has been beckoning my children from his window at night. I, 33M, live in Texas with my daughter, Alicia, 8F, and my son, Jay, 4M. Their mom has been out of the picture for the past 2 years, not dead, just a piece of shit, and I've managed pretty well as a single father. The three of us lived in a 2-bedroom in a nice neighborhood. I've got a solid job, and the kids are thankfully healthy. Everything was smooth sailing until one night, 2 months ago, during which I was awoken by Jay poking me in the face. He was sobbing violently, though I recognized it as the "I'm afraid" kind of crying as opposed to the "I'm hurt" kind of crying, which made me a little less worried. Jay's always been nightmare-prone, so I assumed that's what was causing him distress. When I asked him what was wrong, though, he said, "The man in the next house is making scary faces at me." I'd heard my fair share of Jay's stories about monsters terrorizing him from the dark corners of his bedroom, but this was something new. I assumed he meant our neighbor's house, and the lack of fantastical elements in his description made me uneasy. It felt too specific to be one of his usual nightmares. I got out of bed and walked with Jay in tow to my kids' room. Alicia was awake in the top bunk. From the soft glow of their night light, I could see her crossing her arms and scowling down at her little brother. I didn't turn on any lights to give myself a better view of the outdoors and peered out the bedroom window. Their window had curtains on it, but for once they hadn't been drawn all the way, and there was a small opening between them through which Jay must have looked out. One side of the neighbor's house, the one to our left from the street, was visible from Alicia and Jay's room. There were 2 windows on the neighbor's side of the house, but it was too dark inside to see anything. I recall from what I'd seen in the daylight that the window on the left, the one closest to the front of the house, was the kitchen. I wasn't sure what the window on the right was, as it always had its curtains drawn. I asked Alicia if she'd seen anything, and she shook her head. "He's always having nightmares and crying. I don't want to share a room with him anymore, Dad. I never get any sleep. It's not fair." Of course, hearing that made Jay start crying again, so I let him sleep in my room for the night. He has this TMNT indoor camping tent that he prefers to his actual bed. Honestly, at that point, I half suspected his nightmare to be a ploy to get me to let him camp. Anyway, I guess I'm a total pushover because he slept in that tent in my room for the next 2 nights. On the 3rd night, I was again woken up, but this time by Alicia, who was standing over me and shaking my arm. That kid hadn't woken me up in the middle of the night for years. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, "The neighbor was making faces at me." Those words, and the fear in my daughter's voice, really put me on edge. I closed the curtains when I said goodnight. "Did you open them?" "Only a little, but it's 'cause I heard a weird noise." "What did you hear?" Alicia couldn't recall exactly. According to her, she had gotten out of bed to see what was going on, and when she lifted the curtain, she saw a light on in the neighbor's window. The curtains in the back room had been drawn back, and our neighbor was standing in his house, right up against the window frame. What was he doing? Alicia thought for a moment, and then made an expression I never want to see on my child's face, or anyone else's for that matter, ever again. I won't do it justice by describing it, but it looks something like this. First, she smiled with both sets of teeth, so that there was a little open sliver between the rows, and then she furrowed her eyebrows. She inclined her head towards me, kind of Kubrick stare-esque, and strained the muscles in her neck. The worst part, though, was what she did with her hands. She held out her left arm, forearm up. Then she clenched her right hand into a fist and moved it back and forth rapidly over her forearm. Poor thing described it as playing the violin, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that my neighbor was pantomiming cutting. Disturbed, I told Alicia to stop and to not make either the expression or the gesture again. I was angry and confused. My neighbor, a man in his 40s, was a bit of a recluse, but he had seemed normal enough in the 3 or 4 times I'd spoken to him. I couldn't fathom why he would do something like that to my kids. After asking Alicia a few more questions, I realized that my neighbor might not have done anything technically, or at least legally, wrong. It wasn't against the law to make inappropriate gestures in your own home, but it seemed like he was targeting my kids specifically. Legal or not, I planned to have a little chat with him the following morning. My last question to Alicia was if our neighbor had made any other gestures, and she nodded. Then, she started making beckoning, come here motions with both of her hands. I had Alicia sleep in my room for the night as well. I also checked out the window in my kids' room, but like before, I saw nothing. The house was completely dark. The next morning before work and after dropping Alicia and Jay off to school, I spent a good 5 minutes knocking on my neighbor's front door. I figured he was home since his car was in the driveway, but he never answered the door. Eventually, I had to leave for work, and as I was walking away, I turned around quickly to see if he was watching me. He was the coward. I saw him for a split second at the front window before he ducked beneath the sill and out of view. Clearly, the guy had problems. I yelled out to him to stop with us, and then left. That same night, I put a plan in motion. While my kids slept in my room, I hung out in theirs. It was a Friday night, and I was ready to pull an all-nighter so that I could catch my neighbor in the act. Although I trusted my kids, I wanted to confirm that there was actually something nefarious going on before I escalated things. I made sure the house was locked up and all the curtains drawn, tucked my kids in, and sat on the floor under the window in their room. At around 9, I started marathoning midnight mass on my phone. I didn't want to wear headphones and miss any strange sounds, so I kept the volume low and mostly read subtitles. At midnight, I started to hear strange sounds. Like Alicia said, it's a bit hard to describe. Best I can do is that it was this low, repeated clicking sound. You know the CHK sound you make to beckon a horse? It was something like that. All I knew is that the sound was undoubtedly coming from a person. After a few minutes of this, the sound switched to what I think was supposed to be a whistle, but it came out all wrong, like someone sucking breath in through their teeth. The sound was so crisp that the neighbor's window must have been open, which was an unsettling thought given that there was only around 15 feet of space between our houses. Certain that the neighbor was at his window, and that this was my best chance to see him, I stood up and pulled the curtain back in one motion. I saw him right away. There was a dim light on in his room, allowing me to see that horrible expression Alicia had made the night prior. It was one thing to see my child's recreation, but it was far more frightening on an adult. His window was indeed open, and his arms were stuck out into the cold night, violently swiping against each other in a grotesque mimicry of self-harm. When he saw me, and realized that he was looking at another grown man and not some poor child, he stopped his erratic motions. His cartoonish grin faded, and another, more genuine emotion settled over his features: rage. The man grabbed the window and slammed it shut, then closed the curtains with the same forcefulness. I let my own curtain fall. I was a little shell-shocked, I think. Of course, I was perturbed by the sight of the man, by his face and his movement, and the fact that he'd been doing that for who knows how many nights now in an attempt to frighten my kids. However, another detail stuck out as even more concerning to me, which was the fact that I genuinely wasn't sure if the man I had just seen was my neighbor. I'd seen him so few times in the years I'd lived in that house, and I was having trouble conjuring up his face. I sat on the floor for a minute, my blood thundering in my ears. I definitely had enough evidence at that point to call the cops, right? Just as I was about to pull out my phone, I heard a tremendous smack against the glass of the bedroom window. After a brief hesitation, I pulled the curtain back again. There were no lights on in the neighbor's house, and there was also no one outside from what I could see. I pulled the curtains back a little further and saw a handprint in the top corner of the window pane. It's worth noting that our house is on a raised foundation, and that particular window is very tall. So even though the window is on the first floor, the man outside would have needed an insane vertical to get his hand up there. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I explained the situation to them, I quickly walked around the house to see if I could catch a glimpse of the man. My last stop was my bedroom. Once inside, I locked the doors, and while still on the phone with the operator, I took my handgun out of the safe in my closet. My heart was beating out of my damn chest, but I knew I had to stay calm. Even more so when I saw that Alicia was awake and looking out of the tent at me. I reassured her in as few words as I could, whispering that we were okay, but we had to stay very quiet. I sat on the edge of my bed, my firearm ready and my ears straining. My kid's tent was in the corner, and to the left of the tent, in the middle of the wall and directly across from where I sat, was a window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something. It was a cloudless night, and the moonlight was bright enough that I could see a silhouette through the white curtains. The dark shape was nebulous at first, but became more clear as the man outside stepped closer to the window. Somehow, he knew which room we were in. The silhouette didn't move for several minutes, and I remember being thankful that, from the angle at which she sat, Alicia couldn't see it. Then, something happened that I couldn't entirely wrap my head around. The man stepped back from the glass and raised his arms, making a Y shape with his body and his limbs. Only his arms were far too long. They seemed to be double the length that they should have been, each arm about the same length as his entire body. I thought at first that he was holding something, maybe two pipes that just appeared to be an extension of his limbs, but I could clearly see two hands at the ends of the extremities. I could see 5 fingers on each hand, flopping around slightly as the man brought his arms closer to the window. Thud, thud, thud. I stood up and readied myself to shoot, but just then the sounds of sirens pierced the quiet night. The man outside banged his hands against the window one last time, and then it was as if someone had sliced his arms at the elbows. His forearms seemed to shear right off, and the man took off running before they so much as hit the ground. When the police officers announced themselves, I answered the door and explained the situation to them. 2 officers, a man and a woman, asked me a few questions about my neighbor, which I assume was necessary to establish probable cause for a search. Once finished, they told me to stay inside with the doors locked while they investigated the neighbor's house. I watched them through the window of Alicia and Jay's room. They knocked on the neighbor's door, and when no one answered, they tried the front door handle. I watched the unlocked door swing open. The 2 looked at one another, and then entered. I'm not sure what they found inside that house. All I know is that when they emerged a few moments later, they both looked very disturbed. When I went outside to ask what they had found, the female officer told me simply, "Your neighbor's dead." The rest of the night was a blur of strangers in uniforms filing in and out of my neighbor's home. Some came to my porch afterwards to ask me questions, and none offered me any answers. They moved with tight-lipped efficiency, their faces guarded, their words clipped. At one point, I wandered to the side of the house and found several people photographing something on the ground outside my bedroom window. Before they could ask me to leave, I made out the gruesome shape of 2 human arms. The kids and I have been staying in my parents' apartment for months, And I think everyone, even Jay, is getting tired of the cramped living situation. We can't stay in the house. Alicia is way too traumatized for that. And I wouldn't be comfortable staying there while the murderer is still at large anyway. I want to sell the damn house, but our story going semi-viral is making that difficult. After all, who would want a house that, thanks to the news, has become permanently associated with phrases like dismemberment and days of torture and victim barely recognizable as human? Fourth story, the Wendigo tapes. It was late when we pulled up to the cabin. The headlights of our Suburban reflected off the darkened windows, briefly shining on the ominous trees that surrounded us. It had been a long driver, and the change in altitude was taking its toll. My parents were normally pretty lively, but I could tell they were beginning to get on each other's nerves. They never bickered, at least in front of us, but they were usually quiet. A slight drizzle started in the night sky, and we all jumped out of the SUV while grabbing our bags. Dad went straight for the cabin, while we quickly made our way behind him. Inside, the new cabin was picture perfect, just like the AD set on Airbnb. It was more luxurious than rustic, but we preferred it that way. Normally, we would have stayed at the family cabin on my mom's side, but the forest fires over the summer had finally taken their toll. We were disappointed, but it was only a matter of time, and we knew that however this didn't help with our adjusting to the new place we were renting. Paintings of landscapes and majestic animals lined the walls, making this almost obnoxious, but that was probably me just being overcritical. The week at the cabin was always a treat everyone looked forward to. It was one of the few things that my family did religiously every year aside from maybe church on Christmas. My brother and I scoured the cabin for our rooms. I ended up taking the loft, which sat in the nook of the A-frame that looked down into the rest of the cabin. Updated carpet as well as log-styled furniture filled the room. In the corner was a dated TV with one of those VCRs built in, but nothing else around it. The walls were designed like logs. The roof angled somewhat sharply, and facing out the rear was a large window. I was able to look out and see the forest that seemed to engulf us. The moon was playing its part in adding a slightly eerie vibe, casting shadows amidst its pale light. I laid my stuff on the bed and glanced out, taking in the breathtaking sight. I turned to put my stuff away and noticed a small door outlined on the log-styled wall. It had a small brass knob that barely stuck out and blended in almost perfectly had it not been for the obnoxious lock that kept it closed. The lock looked old. The opening on it appeared worn, and the key must have been equally large and awkward. Everything in this cabin seemed new, or at least updated aside from the TV in the corner, so it was strange to see something so out of place. I put my things away, paid the random small door no mind. Not much later, my mother called us from the living room, and we all slowly gathered from our separate areas. I don't know about you guys, but I am very hungry. Does anyone want to come with me to get food to bring back here? She asked. Seeing how this cabin didn't have Wi-Fi and we were virtually off the grid, I volunteered. My brother and dad were either too tired or not hungry enough to care, so we made it a girls' trip back into town. So how do you like the cabin so far? Mom asked as we got buckled in the SUV. I mean, I like our old cabin, but this one is slightly nicer. It's newer, but I wish it had Wi-Fi or at least a real TV. I said, trying not to complain. Yeah, the old cabin was nice. It was much closer, but we got a screaming deal on this one. It's probably because it's in the middle of nowhere, but I guess that's the point. We drove out of the woods and back onto the road, leading us into Gavin County. The radio softly played some kind of country music, and Mom went over the plans for the week, most of which were things not taking place at the actual cabin itself. We drove on the empty road, occasionally passing another vehicle, undoubtedly another poor family being forced to spend time together, I thought. The thing I liked about the old cabin was that there were other cabins nearby, some of which we were even friends, but out here, out in the middle of the woods, I felt so incredibly isolated. We drove down to town, where the half-dozen lights of whatever businesses that were still open glowed faintly. I feel like most small towns seem to have a Chinese place, which, unfortunately, this one didn't. But like every small town, it did have a gas station, a pawn shop, and an outdated post office, all of which were closed. There was one diner, however, that still seemed to be open. It had a few cars parked out front, which we ended up pulling into considering we had no other options in town. The diner almost seemed to have a 70s style to it, but that probably wasn't on purpose. We walked inside, and locomotion could be heard in the fairly empty diner. An older gentleman standing behind the counter gave a brief smile and nodded to a booth. "Hope y'all are hungry," he said. "Indeed we are," Mom replied. We sat down and ordered. The man we assumed to be our waiter didn't write anything down, just nodded after each thing. "I'll get that ready for ye. Right quick," he said, ducking back into the kitchen. We were both tired and, worst of all, hungry. A moment of appreciated silence fell between us. I could tell my mom was thinking of something to say to start a conversation, but the man returned too quickly with our food. "Y'all are from out of state?" he asked while placing our orders in front of us. My mom was taken aback. "Oh no, is it that obvious?" "It's not obvious." He smiled. "I saw your plates when you pulled in." "So what brings you here?" My mom laughed. "Yeah, we were just getting away from it all. Our family cabin burned down last summer, so we decided to try something different." "That's too bad," he said. The man turned to leave before my mom awkwardly asked, "Any fun hikes here in town?" Trying to make the best of our situation, the man walked back over to our table while scratching his chin. "Fun hikes? Huh? Well, we don't do a lot of hiking around here. Isn't safe unless you're packing a firearm of some kind. Lots of bears and other things lurking around. This is more of a place you just drive through." He paused. "We do have the Horseshoe Museum, though, which I don't recommend." He chuckled. "Sorry, not much going on here." My mom's attempt to cheer me up failed miserably. "Dang, I'm sure we will find something," Mom replied. "I hope you find it before it finds you," the man said before dipping away to the kitchen. "Why are old people so creepy?" I whispered. "Oh, he was just having fun with us tourists. Plus, that's how old people talk." We ate our meal, and the man came by once or twice to fill our drinks. Both times he was silent, just smiled. We paid our bill and walked out to the SUV. The drive back to the cabin was no less eerie than the first time. The dark trees lined both sides of the road, begging the question, what else lurked inside? We made it back to the cabin around midnight. Time had gotten away from us. My dad and brother had gone to bed, but I could still hear noise coming from Eric's room. He was probably playing on his Switch or something. I went upstairs to the loft and got ready for bed. The loft was nice, but there weren't any blinds on the large window. It wasn't so much an issue because who would have seen me, but it was weird being able to look out into the vast woods unsure of what was looking back. The next morning, I woke to the warm sun slowly rising through the trees. It was earlier than what time I would have normally gotten up, but the light slowly creeping and made it impossible to go back to bed. I went downstairs to the kitchen to find my brother already awake. He was just sitting in the living room, playing more on his Switch. "Is anyone else up?" I asked, still whipping the sleep from my eyes. He glanced up briefly. Doesn't look like it," he said before returning to his game. "Good call, bro," I said, working my way over to the fridge. At the old family cabin, we normally kept the fridge stocked, but at this one it had slipped our minds to bring food. The fridge was empty. I wasn't starving, but I would need to get food soon. I'll just wait for Mom and Dad to get up, I thought. In the meantime, I racked my brain on what to do. I went back upstairs and got dressed for a hike. I wasn't an outdoorsy girl by any means, but I did love a good walk. The sun in all its glory was peering in stronger now. I went downstairs and outside. The morning air was brisk, but fresh with the smell of damp leaves. The cabin's exterior was neatly landscaped. A stone path led around to the back, which I slowly went on as I stretched. Around back was more of the same. Stones were placed neatly guiding me to the woods, undoubtedly leading me to a trail. I followed the stone path out into the woods, and the neatly placed stones eventually stopped at a basic dirt path. One much less cared for. A quick 20-minute walk couldn't hurt. I always had a rule that the second I couldn't see a path, I would stop and turn around. No sense in getting lost in woods I was unfamiliar with. Plus, knowing my brother, he would probably forget to tell my parents I went for a walk. I walked a good 5 minutes when I remembered the conversation from last night. The old man at the diner recommended I have a gun when going into the woods. I stopped in my tracks. Oh, that's right, I sighed, totally unprepared if something were to happen. But then I remembered what my mom said. He was just giving us tourists a hard time. I debated briefly before continuing my hike. I continued my walking for another 20 minutes or so. Not only did the trail eventually end, but at the end of it was a weird sight. It was barely visible, but sitting just off to the left of the trail, down a little ways, appeared to be an old concrete structure. I like to discover things, sure, but I also knew better than to investigate a strange building out in the middle of the woods, at least by myself. Had Eric ever stopped playing Zelda, or I had one of my parents, I would have peeked inside, but being a young girl alone in the woods, no chance. That was until I noticed how dilapidated it was. I could almost see all of it from the outside. It was more of a frame of a large shed than anything. There wouldn't be much to investigate, as it looked more dangerous from a structural standpoint rather than some villainous hideout. The unassuming structure spoke to me, drawing me in like a wounded puppy needing attention. I stepped off the path. I could take a quick peek, I guess, I thought to myself. The hollow shed was only just a few hundred feet away from the trail. I would have to be severely disoriented to not find it again. The odds of the menacing bears that lurked in the woods were staying inside were incredibly small. A concrete frame stood, mostly eroded, and whatever remnants of the roof had been removed a long time ago, if ever existing at all. There were window frames, but no glass. As I got closer, I noticed a very strange sight, more so that the shed itself, hanging on a rusted nail just outside the doorway, was a large key. But to add to the mystery of this key was the weirdest thing dangling off of a chain connected to it. The best way to describe it was that it appeared to be a rabbit's foot, but the trinket didn't have any fur. The nasty-looking bone protruded out of one end and came to a point much like that of a talon or a claw. I didn't have a reason, but I picked up the key. Its weight was rather impressive for such a small item. I tried not to touch the gross-looking keychain on the other end. I was going to put it back, but something caught my eye. Inside the concrete frame, in the center of the floor, was a metal hatch. The hatch itself was rusted and looked incredibly heavy. To my dismay, it was open and sat back at about 160 degrees, not quite touching the other side. I froze in horror. Two things immediately came to realization as I saw drag marks leading down and into the hatch, but also scratch marks on the inside portion of the hatch. I knew immediately that this wasn't a place I should be. Something incredible sinister was taking place here, but I couldn't be sure what it was. Not the slightest spark of courage or curiosity came forth. If anything, I was repelled by the sight. That was enough for today. The shock of seeing the strange bunker and insidious signs of foul play. I slipped the key into my pocket and backpedaled away from the concrete structure. I didn't want to take my eyes off the hatch for fear of whatever lurked beneath sprung forth and dragging me down into the endless abyss below. I quickly found the trail, my nerves slowly calming down the further I got away from the cryptic hatch. I made my way back to the cabin. My mind wondered what mysteries were held beneath the metal hatch. A makeshift meth lab, a well, a bunker someone tried to build and deserted halfway through. My hunger was getting the better of me. My parents had better have been awake by now. It didn't take long for the cabin to slowly come back into view. I could see my room, aka the loft, a good distance away. Creepy to think someone could very well be able to see me, and I would have no idea. I made it back to the cabin and was delighted to see my dad cooking eggs in the kitchen. Eric was still a couch potato and didn't seem to have even moved from last time I saw him. I could hear Mom singing from her bedroom, still getting ready for the day. "Hey, Kay," Dad said, glancing up briefly from the eggs. I smiled. "Hey, Dad, making some for me?" I asked hopefully. "I wasn't, but I can," he said. "That would be amazing." "So how was your walk?" Dad asked. "It was actually really good. I didn't see any bears, and there's a nice little path that leads pretty good out in the woods." I don't know why, but I debated on telling him about the hatch. Like mentioning it would have caused a negative consequence or something. I didn't mention the hatch, but I mentioned the structure. That way I had some form of deniability of going close to it. I saw a little spooky shed building out in the woods I might check out later. My dad nodded. "Oh, sounds like a little family activity for later." Before I could respond, Eric shouted from the couch, "That sounds lame. We need to go to a lake like our last cabin." My dad and I shared a silent moment of judging Eric before dishing me up some eggs. By this time, my mom exited her room wearing workout clothes. "Did I hear something about a hike?" she asked. "Yeah, Kay said there was a little trail out back." I interrupted. "And there weren't any bears," I said, smiling. Mom smiled. "Oh, right, the creepy old guy from the dinner," she chuckled. "Well, I am ready. What about you, Stephen?" Mom said, looking at my dad. "All right now. Are you sure?" Dad said, somewhat off guard. "Kay, hike round two? Check out the spooky shed." I glanced up from my eggs mid-chew. "You know, cool parents only hike it is. See you guys in a bit." My parents left the cabin, and I finished breakfast before heading upstairs. I could see my parents through the window outside as they ventured deeper into the woods. The hike I went on didn't result in any sweat, so I stayed in my workout clothes. Out of the corner of my eye, the large out-of-place padlock caught my attention. I turned my head slightly and saw the outline of the door that blended in so well. Weird. I looked at the lock for a brief moment before an idea slowly came into my mind. It took me longer than it should have, but I finally realized that the lock looked to be of the same material as the skeleton key I found earlier out in the woods. I pulled the key from my pocket and felt the weight of the cold metal. The grotesque keychain dangled lifelessly, causing my skins to crawl. I got to get rid of that. I walked over to the door and knelt down. I didn't even have the key in the lock before my heart began to race. It was as if I knew this would work. I inserted the key with odd smoothness and gave it a twist. A heavy click could be heard, and to my satisfaction, the lock clicked open. "Whoa," I whispered. I pulled hard on the door, which caught on part of the carpet. It was clear that whoever renovated this place didn't plan on anyone opening this door. I pulled harder, pushing my foot against the wall for more leverage, but the door only opened a few inches. Damn, the hard part of finding the key was done. I just had to open the damn thing. I pulled harder, but was only rewarded with a slight opening of a couple inches. I peered inside what little I could open, but was disappointed in not having a clear view. I stuck my arm inside, reaching around for anything, and to my surprise, I felt an open cardboard box. It was heavy, but I pulled it towards the door. I couldn't pull the box through the door, but once I pulled it closer, I was able to reach inside. I started pulling random objects out of the box and through the small door. To my surprise, I started pulling videotapes that were old and had written labels on them. Some of the labels had titles or dates much like any home movie a family would have made. All of the titles seemed inconspicuous, like Family Vacation 1 or Grandma and Grandpa Visit. I fished around more and ended up finding about 9 tapes in total. The tapes that had the dates told me these must have been filmed decades ago, sometime in the early 80s. Seeing how I was bored out of my mind, I picked up the tapes and took them over to the old TV that sat in the corner of the loft. I was fully expecting to be disappointed in that the TV was probably not going to work, but when I pressed the power button, the TV gave off a loud buzz as the screen slowly began to illuminate. I inserted the tape that was titled Family Vacation 1 into the TV as the screen continued to warm up, but the tape was halfway through the film and needed to be rewound. I got distracted and was content with watching where the tape was at. On the screen was a clearly dated timeline, which seemed to take place in a small town. It was mainly just scenes of people walking around. After a few frames in, the cameraman seemed to focus on a family walking around what I assumed was Gavin County at the time, as they went about their normal day of vacation. It didn't strike me odd at first, as the scenes depicted a happy family eating in a restaurant and walking through town. However, all of these seemed to be at a distance. It wasn't until the family got into a red station wagon and drove away that I realized that whoever was filming wasn't with them. The scene cut quickly, and now the grainy TV was showing me a wooden landscape as the person filming was driving now. This only lasted for a few seconds before it quickly changed again. Now it showed a first-person perspective of someone walking in the woods, but they didn't seem to be on any type of trail. I wasn't sure at this point if these images were connected in any way. They just seemed random. That was until the last scene of the tape finally showed a cabin a good ways off, one much more dated and older than this one. However, I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. Parked out front of the cabin was a bright red station wagon. One I assumed was the same one the family had gotten into earlier. The tape ended and a black screen filled the TV before automatically rewinding itself. I put in a second tape that was only titled with a date. This one had been rewind unlike the first. This one took place in a city. It was nighttime. Skyscrapers could be seen illuminated, and a handful of pedestrians went about their own way. The scenes in this video didn't last very long, as they only lasted for a few seconds, most of which were just empty buildings or parking garages. Some scenes had either a person or two, but it was clear that they didn't know they were being filmed. This tape only seemed to last no longer than 5 minutes, but that's all it was. Just eerie scenes of people unaware they were being watched in empty locations. I grabbed a third tape, this one titled My First Friend. I inserted the tape, and an image of an old house appeared on the screen. The house seemed run down, sitting out in an unkempt field of some kind. It was bright out. Again, the perspective was first person. So far in all of these tapes, I didn't get to see who was filming. This tape was one continuous shot. The person slowly approached the home, which was clear that it was abandoned. The front door had been boarded up. The scene slowly showed us walking around the house, filming in windows and peering inside. We turn the corner to come into the backyard and see that the back door is wide open. The person filming slowly approaches, and we can see on the brick steps a dark stain leading through the doorway. I began to get uneasy. We see the camera get close to the stain, but we are not able to make anything out of it. It then goes back to the first person, and we are led inside. Despite the home being abandoned, there is still furniture and appliances inside. However, it is completely destroyed and clear that someone or some type of animal had once made this their home. Trash and leaves were scattered about the home. The stain could still be seen in some shots, and crying began to be heard from inside. The cameraman finally follows the stain, which leads to an open doorway. He pauses as the cries get louder. He then peers inside the doorway to see a set of stairs leading down into a dark basement. He takes a single step before the scene abruptly ends. What the hell were these tapes? I ejected the tape and set it with all the others. I made sure to lay them all out so I could see all of their labels. I saw a tape that was titled Family Vacation 2, which I assumed to be a continuation of the first tape. I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I was about to watch. My mind raced as I could only assume the worst. I found myself becoming more and more uneasy, but I inserted the tape anyway. The scene started with a morbid image of a dead deer on the side of the road. Its body was bloated, and clearly it had been impacted by a vehicle moving at high speeds. A stick could be seen briefly, poking at its dead body before the scene changed. It was more driving, but it was dark out. I could barely make out the silhouette of trees in the dim headlight of the cameraman's car. He pulled over on the side of the road, and the scene ended. The screen went black, but I could hear sounds of something being dragged through the woods. This was the first time I heard the cameraman speak. He swore softly as he grunted while doing something laborious off-screen. A light could be seen as the scene changed. We were outside of a cabin from earlier, but not terribly far away. The light inside reveals the family from earlier, but enjoying their evening oblivious that this person was filming outside. They seemed to be laughing or talking as we sat quietly in the darkness. This went on for a while as we just sat still and watched. Finally, the lights from inside go off and the dragging sound continues. We hear something being dragged onto what sounded like wooden boards before the scene changes abruptly. It's morning time, and we see the front of the cabin. We are behind the red station wagon and see the dead deer from earlier on the porch laying in front of the door before the tape ends. It had seemed that each tape I put in, it got more and more disturbing, more unsettling. I grabbed another tape, but I could only imagine the worst. It was titled Dinner with Friend. This tape was at the end of the recording, so I had to rewind to the beginning. This took a few moments as the screen was blue, slowly blinking, rewind, as a whirring sound could be heard within. I was fixated on the screen, completely obsessed with this stash of nostalgic morbid tapes. The screen immediately displayed an image of a woman gagged and bloodied. She was staring directly in front of the camera, sobbing. She was in some kind of dark room with a very dull flashlight shined right on her face. "Oh my gosh," I whispered, putting my hand over my mouth. The camera slowly steps away, revealing her leg was chained to a concrete wall. "I want you to meet my friend," a soft masculine voice said from behind the camera. "Maybe we can all be friends?" The camera then turned and pointed to the other side of the room, revealing a large, unfinished basement, but one you wouldn't find in a house, more like some kind of abandoned building. Several concrete pillars stood, and the man shined his light in between as if he was expecting something to come out of the darkness. You couldn't see the other end of the basement, but I was beginning to fear that the cameraman was the least of this poor woman's problems. You could hear the chain behind the cameraman move slightly, the woman's soft sobs continuing. "Richard," the man cooed, as if trying to coax out a pet from underneath a couch gently. The man began to chuckle. I don't know if that's his real name, but I like to think that's what he'd like to be called. He doesn't like to talk. The light continued to scan in the dark before resting on a pale figure that could be seen briefly poking its head out from behind the pillar. The figure was at a distance, and the viewer was not able to get a good look, plus camera quality was incredibly poor. Just pixels of what I assumed to be something terrible. The woman, despite being gagged, began to scream terrified, muffled cries. She clearly didn't like what she saw. The man began to backpedal, clearly worried. "There he is," he whispered. "There's Richard. You get to meet him." The woman continued to scream while tried to follow the cameraman, who was clearly distancing himself before the chain had reached its end. The man filming continued to back up, leaving the woman in between himself and the pale figure lurking in the darkness. The frame then held still as the woman pulled on the chain frantically. The beam of the flashlight would occasionally shine on her, and then behind her, as I expected to see something come from the darkness. To my absolute horror, I saw why the woman was so frantic. Slowly approaching from the darkness appeared to be something tall. It was hard to make out details at first since the lens was not focused on him. I could tell by the pale outline that whatever this thing was not wearing any clothes, and it most certainly wasn't human. The creature slowly came into view, revealing a horrifying face. Skin pulled tight over sharp and ragged bones. Eyes sunk deep into its head, and teeth seemed to spill out of its mouth as it appeared to be smiling. Long arms reached forwards, grabbing hold of the chain with clawed hands, and began to slowly pull the woman towards him. The woman tried to pull back, but it was useless. "Shhhh," the man hushed. "Don't scare him. It will only make it worse." This only made the woman panic more. The woman slowly got pulled away, and I hoped to God that the tape would end like the others, but it didn't. The creature grabbed hold of the woman's arm and pulled it effortlessly off of her body. Blood spewed violently as the creature dropped her and began to take large bites of the removed limb, but it then did something that shocked me. Something even more than this horrible nightmare that came to life before me. It then held out the limb to the woman as she flailed on the ground in pain and stared at her. It extended its hand towards her face and sliced off the gag and held her flesh towards her face. "Eat it," the man whispered. "He wants to share with you." The cameraman then slowly inched forward as he tried to get a good shot of what was happening when the scene ended. I tried to mentally digest what I just saw. I couldn't believe it. I had easily just witnessed the worst thing I had ever seen. Why the hell were these tapes here, and who made them? I got up and removed myself from the tapes and went downstairs. I had to tell my parents. I had to tell them what I found and turn these tapes into the police. Eric had made his way over to the kitchen and was eating his snack, his Switch charging next to him. "Where's Mom and Dad?" I asked, somewhat on edge. He glanced in my direction, but didn't look at me. "Good question." Still on that hike, I guess." I checked the time. I had easily just watched an hour of who knows what. There's no way that they were still on that trail. Maybe they found another trail or went into town without telling us, I thought. I checked outside, and the SUV was still parked out front. I then remembered the hatch. I just prayed that they didn't do anything stupid, that they had enough common sense to leave the mysterious hatch alone, but things weren't adding up. I waited for them for another hour, but they never showed up. It was now late in the afternoon. It was going to get dark soon. I took the keys to the SUV and made my way over to the front door. "Eric, you should probably come with me. I'm going to head into town and get ice cream. You want to come?" I had to lie. I knew if I told him the truth, he wouldn't believe me or just wouldn't listen. "Ice cream? Yeah. But shouldn't we wait for Mom and Dad?" I paused. No, you wouldn't let us go if they knew." He had a smile on his face, and I knew he was in. We went outside and got into the SUV and took off back into town. It took us longer than I remembered, but we rolled in around 4 p.m. To my surprise, despite finally having cellular data again, the town didn't have a police station. I called 911 and got an operator on the line, but when she asked me for the address, I completely blanked. The address. There's no address. It's just some cabin off the road heading into Gavin County. I said. The woman on the other line wasn't helpful. "Well, what's the emergency you would like to report?" A slight hint of sass in her voice. "My parents have been missing all morning. I don't know what to do." The woman paused before responding. "Well, let me see what I can do." I kept the woman on the line, and we drove back to the cabin, still on hold as we waited for a response. Eric was upset about the ice cream, but I told him we'll make it up to him. I parked outside of the cabin and told him to wait here and talk to the operator if she ever got back on the line. I knew what I had to do. I had to look for them myself. I went into the cabin and found a large steak knife in the kitchen and a flashlight under the sink. For good measure, I went back upstairs and grabbed the key and put it in my pocket. I went out the back door of the cabin and headed on the trail that led deep into the woods. The trail was less pleasant than earlier, my mind still swarming with thought of what I had witnessed on that old TV. I just hoped that my parents gotten lost or something incredibly harmless happened, but it was so unlike them to just run off like this. You could hear the chain behind the cameraman move slightly, the woman's soft sobs continuing. "Richard," the man cooed, as if trying to coax out a pet from underneath a couch gently. The man began to chuckle. I don't know if that's his real name, but I like to think that's what he'd like to be called. He doesn't like to talk. The light continued to scan in the dark before resting on a pale figure that could be seen briefly poking its head out from behind the pillar. The figure was at a distance, and the viewer was not able to get a good look, plus camera quality was incredibly poor. Just pixels of what I assumed to be something terrible. The woman, despite being gagged, began to scream terrified, muffled cries. She clearly didn't like what she saw. The man began to backpedal, clearly worried. "There he is," he whispered. "There's Richard. You get to meet him." The woman continued to scream while tried to follow the cameraman, who was clearly distancing himself before the chain had reached its end. The man filming continued to back up, leaving the woman in between himself and the pale figure lurking in the darkness. The frame then held still as the woman pulled on the chain frantically. The beam of the flashlight would occasionally shine on her, and then behind her, as I expected to see something come from the darkness. To my absolute horror, I saw why the woman was so frantic. Slowly approaching from the darkness appeared to be something tall. It was hard to make out details at first since the lens was not focused on him. I could tell by the pale outline that whatever this thing was not wearing any clothes, and it most certainly wasn't human. The creature slowly came into view, revealing a horrifying face. Skin pulled tight over sharp and ragged bones. Eyes sunk deep into its head, and teeth seemed to spill out of its mouth as it appeared to be smiling. Long arms reached forwards, grabbing hold of the chain with clawed hands, and began to slowly pull the woman towards him. The woman tried to pull back, but it was useless. "Shhhh," the man hushed. "Don't scare him. It will only make it worse." This only made the woman panic more. The woman slowly got pulled away, and I hoped to God that the tape would end like the others, but it didn't. The creature grabbed hold of the woman's arm and pulled it effortlessly off of her body. Blood spewed violently as the creature dropped her and began to take large bites of the removed limb, but it then did something that shocked me. Something even more than this horrible nightmare that came to life before me. It then held out the limb to the woman as she flailed on the ground in pain and stared at her. It extended its hand towards her face and sliced off the gag and held her flesh towards her face. "Eat it," the man whispered. "He wants to share with you." The cameraman then slowly inched forward as he tried to get a good shot of what was happening when the scene ended. I tried to mentally digest what I just saw. I couldn't believe it. I had easily just witnessed the worst thing I had ever seen. Why the hell were these tapes here, and who made them? I got up and removed myself from the tapes and went downstairs. I had to tell my parents. I had to tell them what I found and turn these tapes into the police. Eric had made his way over to the kitchen and was eating a snack, his Switch charging next to him. "Where's Mom and Dad?" I asked, someone on edge. He glanced in my direction, but didn't look at me. "Good question. Still on that hike, I guess." I checked the time. I had easily just watched an hour of who knows what. There's no way that they were still on that trail. Maybe they found another trail or went into town without telling us, I thought. I checked outside, and the SUV was still parked out front. I then remembered the hatch. I just prayed that they didn't do anything stupid, that they had enough common sense to leave the mysterious hatch alone, but things weren't adding up. I waited for them for another hour, but they never showed up. It was now late in the afternoon. It was going to get dark soon. I took the keys to the SUV and made my way over to the front door. "Eric, you should probably come with me. I'm going to head into town and get ice cream. You want to come?" I had to lie. I knew if I told him the truth, he wouldn't believe me or just wouldn't listen. "Ice cream?" "Yeah. But shouldn't we wait for Mom and Dad?" I paused. No, you wouldn't let us go if they knew." He had a smile on his face, and I knew he was in. We went outside and got into the SUV and took off back into town. It took us longer than I remembered, but we rolled in around 4 p.m. To my surprise, despite finally having cellular data again, the town didn't have a police station. I called 911 and got an operator on the line, but when she asked me for the address, I completely blanked. The address, there's no address, it's just some cabin off the road heading into Gavin County. I said, The woman on the other line wasn't helpful. "Well, what's the emergency you would like to report?" A slight hint of sass in her voice. "My parents have been missing all morning. I don't know what to do." The woman paused before responding. "Well, let me see what I can do." I kept the woman on the line, and we drove back to the cabin, still on hold as we waited for a response. Eric was upset about the ice cream, but I told him we'll make it up to him. I parked outside of the cabin and told him to wait here and talk to the operator if she ever got back on the line. I knew what I had to do. I had to look for them myself. I went into the cabin and found a large steak knife in the kitchen and a flashlight under the sink. For good measure, I went back upstairs and grabbed the key and put it in my pocket. I went out the back door of the cabin and headed on the trail that led deep into the woods. The trail was less pleasant than earlier, my mind still swarming with thought of what I had witnessed on that old TV. I just hoped that my parents gotten lost or something incredibly harmless happened, but it was so unlike them to just run off like this. Fifth story. My grandmother told me a scary bedtime story. Years later, I found out that the story she told me was horrifyingly true. I watched from a distance while my grandma and grandpa fished on their lake in the backyard, but one thing confused me. While grandpa cast his line and watched his rod, waiting for the anticipating tug of a fish, grandma's gaze remained fixed across the lake, her head tilted intently towards the dark fringe of woods. I never saw her look at the bobbing lures. She didn't even seem interested in fishing at all. I thought that maybe she just simply enjoyed looking at the trees. But a nagging feeling persisted. There was more to her gaze than a simple love for nature. It was summer break, and I decided to spend it at my grandparents' house in Knoxville, Tennessee. They lived in a 2-story house, recently built in 2018. It connected directly to a lake, with a dock jutting out on the far right side where my grandpa kept his bass boat. My grandparents were a sweet and quiet couple. They kept to themselves most of the time, living a peaceful life in their little corner of the world. Every summer, though my visits became a tradition, Grandma's invitation was always an automatic yes, her warm smile and gentle voice a beacon calling me back. There were countless things to love about my grandma, her kindness and generosity at the top of the list. If I wanted something, it was usually an automatic yes from her too. But one of the things I truly cherished most was her stories. Unlike Grandpa, who mostly stuck to tales of his time in the military, exciting stories filled with bravery and adventure, of course, Grandma was a bottomless well of stories. Whether it was a funny story from her childhood, a heartwarming story about a kind neighbor, or a fantastical bedtime story that transported me to magical lands, Grandma always had one on hand. She was one of those special grandmas who could weave a story from thin air, her words painting vivid pictures in my mind. Grandpa, on the other hand, was a man of few words. A quiet strength emanated from him, and the stories he did tell were always about his service. He'd talk about the places he'd been, the challenges he'd faced, and the lessons he'd learned. While not as fantastical as Grandma's stories, they held a different kind of magic, a testament to his resilience and the experiences that shaped him. One of the things I always admired about Grandpa was his outdoor skills. He'd tell me most of his knowledge came from his military training, jokingly saying they prepared him for anything. He was a true outdoorsman, the kind of person I'd trust implicitly if we were ever lost in the wilderness. He knew everything about fishing, the best spots on the lake, the best techniques to catch different types of fish. Some of my favorite memories were spent on his boat, cutting through the cool morning water, the sun rising over the horizon, and the gentle hum of the motor a comforting lullaby. Every night, Grandma dipped into her seemingly endless well of stories. I never quite understood how she did it. Her mind was like a sprawling library, shelves overflowing with stories to tell. One night, she'd tell me a story of brave knights seeking vengeance, their swords gleaming in the sun. Another night, She'd tell me a story of a land shimmering with magic spells and cursed lands. Then there were the scary stories. Now, Grandma usually avoided them. She knew how they affected me. But the thing about those stories was the detail. Oh man, the detail. They were so vivid, so real, it felt like I was peeking through a crack into another world. A world where the monsters and creatures she described lurked. A world so terrifying that I felt like falling through that crack would kill me. Every night was the same routine. Nestled under a patchwork quilt in the guest room, I'd wait with bated breath. The soft click of the doorknob was my cue. Grandma, her face etched with a lifetime of stories, would enter, a gentle smile gracing her lips. She'd pull up a rocking chair, its rhythmic creak adding to the lullaby effect. Then, in a warm voice, she'd begin telling me a story. One night, though, tucked under the patchwork quilt, I waited for Grandma's nightly visit. The soft click of the doorknob announced her arrival. "Ready for another story?" she asked, her voice a warm rumble. I nodded eagerly. Nights at Grandma's were journeys to magical lands, each story more thrilling than the last. But tonight, I craved a different kind of story, a different kind of excitement. "Can you tell me a scary story tonight, Grandma?" I blurted out. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a thoughtful pause. Unlike her usual repertoire of action-packed adventures, her stories have always steered clear of scary ones. She sat beside me on the patchwork quilt, her usual mischievous eyes replaced by a thoughtful gaze. Her eyes flickered towards the window for a moment before returning to me. Then, with a gentle smile, she began. "Those woods outside your window," she started, her voice a warm rumble. I instinctively glanced towards the window, the familiar silhouette of the trees, outlined across the lake. "There's something in those woods," she continued, her voice dropping to a hushed whisper. A shiver danced down my spine, though the room remained pleasantly warm. Those simple words made me so uncomfortable that I was tempted to just tell Grandma to stop, but the truth was I was hooked. Grandma did tell me scary stories on rare occasions, but they were always fictional, completely disconnected from the real world. She continued, "Every 7 years, it comes out of those woods. It emerges a creature that's been on this earth for thousands of years. It crawls on all fours. It hunts, a silent predator searching for its prey." I began to tense up a little. The room remained quiet, but the air felt heavy. "Its body is like a man, but twisted and contorted," she murmured, "and its limbs elongated, reaching out at odd angles. Its skin is black as coal, making it difficult to spot during the night." I swallowed hard, my eyes instinctively drawn back to the window. The trees, once comforting, now seemed to writhe with unseen shadows. "But the worst part," she continued, her voice barely a tremor, "is its eyes, multiple eyes, scattered across its head like a spider. They pierce the darkness, searching for an unsuspecting victim." She continued, her voice a hushed whisper, sending shivers down my spine. "Sometimes, if it has trouble finding prey, it ventures closer, closer to houses, searching for unlocked windows." My breath caught in my throat. The image of eyes peering through the glass sent a jolt of terror through me. "If it finds an opening," she murmured, "it will crawl inside and snatch the closest person to it, dragging them back to the woods." I squeezed my eyes shut, the warmth of the quilt a poor barrier against the sudden chill. "It keeps its victims alive for 7 long years," she whispered, "feeding off them slowly, until the hunger returns and it's time to hunt once more." My grip tightened on the blanket, and my knuckles were white. A cold sweat was dripping down my skin. "But don't you worry," she said, her voice gentling. "As long as we keep the windows locked, we'll be safe. And don't forget to do the same at your mom's house." She rose from the quilt, her smile strained at the edges. A smile meant to reassure, but one that couldn't hide the sliver of unease in her eyes. Her movements seemed slow and deliberate as she walked towards the window. My eyes followed her, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She stared out of the window for a moment, as if checking to make sure the thing wasn't around, and then she checked to make sure the window was locked. Just as she was about to turn away, I blurted out, unable to contain the question that had lodged itself in my throat. "Grandma, have you ever seen it?" She paused for a few moments, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before a reassuring smile crept onto her lips. She didn't answer me. She simply leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture filled with a strange intensity. "Good night, darling," she whispered. Then, with a gentle click, she shut my door behind her. I was awake for most of that night, staring at the darkened window pane. The familiar silhouette of the woods outside now held a new kind of terror. I kept wondering if I would see that face my grandma described, a face with multiple eyes staring back at me. Eventually, exhausted from fear and lack of sleep, my eyelids drifted shut, and I finally drifted off. While I slept, I dreamt of its form shifting and writhing in the darkness. I ran, my legs pumping, but it was like I was running on ice. Panic seized me as the figure lunged, its long arms wrapping around my legs. It dragged me, a rag doll, through the grass, the stench of damp grass filling my nostrils. The woods grew bigger as the thing dragged me there, its jagged edges threatening to devour me whole. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the branches of the trees were about to engulf me, I jolted awake, gasping for breath. Light streamed through the window, painting familiar shapes on the ceiling. The room held a peaceful stillness. It took several deep breaths to slow the pounding of my heart. Relief washed over me, chasing away the lingering dread. Since that night, despite Grandma's steady stream of new stories, the creature in the woods has remained a constant shadow in the corner of my mind. Thankfully, the nightmares, those terrifying chases through endless woods, didn't last. Slowly, the story faded from memory. A few years later, a different kind of darkness descended upon our family. Cancer, a cruel, selfish thief, stole my grandmother's health bit by bit. She fought for months, but in the end, the disease won. It left a hole in our lives, especially for Grandpa. Now he lives alone, the silence of the house heavy with her absence. Talking about her seems to bring a fresh wave of pain, etched deep into the lines on his face. Sometimes he murmurs about just waiting for his turn to join her. It's a heartbreaking sight, a man transformed into a solitary figure, simply waiting to die. That year was a blur of grief, a dark tunnel we all had to navigate. But with the love and support of family and friends, we eventually managed to pull through. With each passing year, the grief lessened, but Grandma's memory remained. Then, after another few years, during my senior year in high school, something happened. I walked into the house after a long day. The familiar scent of an empty house greeted me. Mom had already left for work. Pulling my backpack onto my bed, I pulled out my books and settled in for an evening of homework, studying, and the occasional break to watch TV. I shut off the TV, changed into my pajamas, and crawled into bed. Sleep, however, remained elusive. My mind was a tangled mess, tossing and turning over the events of the day. Finally, I peeked at the clock on my desk, its green glow reading almost 3 a.m. Just then, a sound shattered the silence, a sharp tap that echoed through the room. My eyes flew open, snapping towards the window. A wave of ice washed over me, freezing my blood solid. Memories of Grandma's story flooded back. The creature, the woods, There, pressed against the glass, was a form that blocked most of the moonlight from filtering in. If not for the sliver of moonlight peeking in around what was blocking it, I wouldn't have been able to see it at all. Its human-shaped body pressed against the window, and across its head, I could have sworn I saw movement, a flicker like multiple tiny insects scurrying across its flesh. Then, a horrifying realization dawned on me. They weren't insects. They were eyelids. Eyelids flickering open and shut, scanning my room with frantic urgency. My breath hitched. Was this a dream? Just then, a shadowy limb, long and impossibly thin, snaked out towards the base of my window. Had I locked the window? The sickening sound of the window, as the glass began to slide up, hit my ears. Terror choked and screamed in my throat. There are woods behind my mom's house too, and a sickening realization dawned on me. This wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was here. Adrenaline surged through me, and my flight or fight responses kicked in. I threw myself out of bed in a desperate scramble. My feet pounded the floor as I bolted towards the door, flinging it open, but my escape was cut short. The door slammed shut in my face, the force of it throwing me backward. A strangled cry escaped my lips as a wave of terror washed over me. My body locked up, and every muscle seized in a silent scream. Somehow, it was now in my room, that fast. It was no longer at the window. It was now above me, above my door. One of its grotesquely long limbs, tipped with a hand like a spider's claw, pressed firmly against the door, pinning me inside. Another seemed contorted at an unnatural angle, its fingers splayed against the wall in a grotesque parody of a grip. The head, if you could call it that, twisted on its neck in a way that defied human anatomy, almost spinning completely around. A chorus of eyes locked onto me. Trapped and alone, I stumbled back, my mind scrambling for any flicker of hope. The second floor was an escape route, but a leap out the window would likely result in injury, leaving me in a vulnerable position. Besides, that's where it probably wanted me. Right next to the door stood my wooden baseball bat. In a desperate lunge, I grabbed it, the wood rough against my grip. With a yell, I swung the bat with all my strength, connecting with a sickening thud. Splinters of wood rained down as the impact sent a tremor through the room. The creature recoiled slightly, its multiple eyes flickering in what might have been surprise. But the silence that followed was the most unsettling part. No roar of pain, no growl. This thing moved with an unnatural quiet. Even as it moved, it made no noise. It descended to the floor, its grotesque form dwarfing the space in my room. As it loomed closer, lowering its body in a predatory crouch, I swung the mangled bat wildly. The bat connected with a bone-crunching impact, sending more shards of wood flying through the air. The creature recoiled, its grotesque form momentarily faltering. Seizing my chance, I bolted past the thing, flung open the bedroom door, and slammed it shut behind me with a resounding bang. Adrenaline pumping, I raced down the stairs, each step echoing in the sudden silence. Reaching the living room, I fumbled for the light switch, illuminating the space with a warm glow. Panting, I gripped the broken bat like a lifeline, its splintered end pointed towards the top of the stairs, towards the thing in my room. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the tense silence, the creak of the front door opening. A silhouette emerged from the doorway, the dim porch light casting long shadows across her face. "There you are?" My mom's voice, laced with exhaustion. "What the hell are you?" The sentence died on her lips, completely cut short. Her eyes widened, but neither she nor I had time to react. In a sharp and quick moment, a shadowy, distorted limb, tipped with a spidery claw, shot out, wrapping around my mother's waist. It snagged her, sinking its talons deep into her flesh, a sickening tear echoing in the sudden silence. A strangled noise bubbled in her throat, cut short before it could form a scream. But then, I heard her scream fully formed as the thing dragged her away to the woods. I ran with all my effort, but the thing was too fast. All I could do was keep running, watching, as my mom screamed with her arms folded around the creature's arm in a desperate attempt to escape. It had her, though, exactly where it wanted her, out in the open. I fell face first into the grass, a sob wrenching its way out of my chest. Warm tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision as I watched in horror. Mom's screams turned into blood-curdling shrieks, fading into a horrifying silence as they disappeared into the indistinguishable maw of the woods. The police came, but what could they do? What could I tell them? I told them exactly what I saw. They looked at me like I was crazy, but what else could I say? For hours, I sat in a sterile interrogation room, the harsh overhead light blurring my vision. They questioned me over and over, dissecting my story, searching for inconsistencies. But all I could do was repeat the horrifying scene, my voice cracking with each retelling. There was no evidence to tie me to my mom's disappearance. Nothing but my frantic pleas and the raw terror etched onto my face. Finally, they seemed to reach a reluctant roadblock. With a sigh and a dismissive glance, they released me. Now, a search party combs the backyard, venturing into the dense woods behind our house. Bloodhounds sniff the damp earth, their mournful howls echoing through the trees. In my room, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. As the harsh light of dawn breaks, I stare at the window. A large handprint, a grotesque, splayed imprint of multiple fingers, clings to the outside of the glass. A cold realization settles over me. Now I know that at least one of my grandma's stories is real. Thanks a lot for watching the video. Till the end, subscribe to Horror in Detail for more videos. Drop your suggestions in comment section.